All right, so let's talk about the Munich Security Conference. Seems like it was quite the event.
It was quite a show, for sure.
We had Zelenskyy calling for a European army, and the U.S. Vice President giving a pretty controversial speech, sparking all sorts of diplomatic tension.
It definitely set the stage for some interesting conversations about the future of the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there. We've been poring over news reports and expert analyses to see what we can learn from all of this. Ready to get into it?
Absolutely. It's fascinating to see these events expose some of the deeper tensions that have been simmering below the surface for a while.
Right, so we have a lot to dig into. Our mission today is to understand what exactly Zelenskyy meant with his proposal, decode what JD Vance was really saying in his speech, and explore how all of this impacts transatlantic cooperation.
Sounds like a plan.
Let's start with Zelensky's call for a European army. Pretty bold move, huh?
It certainly was. To truly grasp the weight of that statement, though, you have to consider the context. I mean, Ukraine is in a fight for survival against Russia.
Right, and anxieties are running high across Europe with growing concerns about security and a real reliance on the U.S. for defense.
Exactly. And Zelenskyy didn't mince words. He just came right out and said, the armed forces of Europe must be created.
No beating around the bush there.
Not at all. And that kind of directness coming from a wartime leader, it raises a crucial question. Is Europe ready to take on a more independent role in global security? Because creating a European army, that has massive implications.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, how are different European leaders reacting to that statement behind closed doors? But before we dive into that, can you walk us through some of those implications you mentioned? What are the potential consequences of creating a European army?
Well, think about the power dynamics within NATO. A Europe that's less reliant on the U.S. for military could significantly shift that balance.
That's a huge shift.
Right. And then there are all the practical hurdles, too. Who's going to foot the bill for this massive undertaking? How do you merge the military structures and doctrines of dozens of countries? It's a logistical nightmare. And that's not even to mention the fact that not all European leaders are thrilled about this idea.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder about those leaders who might be feeling a little uneasy about their NATO membership right now. But as if this wasn't enough to process, you had JD Vance giving a speech that just threw more fuel onto the fire.
Oh, yeah, that speech was a game changer. You know, with a new administration in place, everyone was kind of anticipating a more collaborative approach. But instead, Vance chose to focus on what he sees as threats coming from within Europe itself.
It was certainly unexpected. It's like he was saying, forget external adversaries like Russia or China. The real danger is coming from within.
Exactly. And he even went so far as to compare some European policies to those of authoritarian regimes.
It's a little ironic, isn't it? You have an American vice president standing on a global stage criticizing Europe's handling of democracy.
Right. It definitely raised some eyebrows, but it also really highlights the fundamental difference in how the U.S. and Europe viewed this balance between free speech and security, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And the German response to all of this was anything but passive. I mean, Scholz basically told Vance to back off, saying, we will not accept that people who look at Germany from the outside intervene in our democracy.
Strong words.
And Pistorius went even further, calling Vance's comparisons unacceptable.
Yeah, their reactions were strong but understandable when you consider the historical and political context.
Definitely. But what does this all mean in the grand scheme of things? Is this just a war of words, or is this a sign of a deeper rift forming between the U.S. and Europe?
I think it's a bit of both. These disagreements have been brewing for a while, but they've finally boiled over onto the public stage. And it's not just about free speech or military strategy. It's about fundamental differences in how the U.S. and Europe see the world, differences in how they understand democracy, how they approach security threats, and ultimately what role they see the U.S. playing in European affairs.
Makes you wonder how the average European citizen is processing all of this. Would they feel reassured or concerned about the future?
That's a tough question to answer. On one hand, you've got the U.S., a long-standing ally, openly criticizing your government and its internal policies. But on the other hand, you have a wartime president pleading for Europe to step up and take charge of its own destiny. It's definitely a lot to process, and it raises some real anxieties about what the future holds for the transatlantic alliance.
Definitely a lot to think about there, and we're going to keep exploring all of this in our next segment.
You know what's fascinating about this whole situation? It really lays bare a fundamental dilemma at the heart of the transatlantic relationship.
Okay, I'm listening. What's the dilemma?
On the one hand, you've got the U.S., historically the protector and guarantor of European security, the backbone of NATO, providing that military muscle and strategic leadership.
Right, but I'm guessing that's not the whole story.
Of course not. This role for the U.S. has come with an expectation of influence, a sense that they should have a say in how Europe handles its affairs.
Okay, so that's the U.S. perspective. What about the view from the other side of the pond?
Well, on the other hand, you have Europe increasingly asserting its autonomy and seeking a more independent role on the world stage. They're dealing with these new security threats, things like Russian aggression and terrorism, and there's a growing sentiment that they need to develop their own capabilities to address these threats.
So it's almost like a teenager wanting more freedom, but still relying on their parents for support.
That's a great analogy. Europe is coming of age, but that process always comes with some friction and growing pains, and that's what we're seeing play out right now.
So Zelensky's call for a European army is a direct challenge to the existing security structure. He's essentially saying Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet.
Exactly, and Vance's speech, whether intentionally or not, is just adding fuel to that fire. By highlighting what he sees as internal weaknesses within Europe, he's kind of inadvertently bolstering the argument for greater self-reliance.
It's almost like he's saying, look, if you can't even manage your own affairs, how can you expect us to protect you?
Right. And regardless of his intent, that message is really resonating with those who believe Europe needs to forge its own path.
But let's be realistic. Creating a European army is a monumental task. Where would you even begin?
Well, first you'd have to tackle the fundamental question of purpose. What is this army for? Is it supposed to replace NATO, complement it? What are the strategic goals here? And then there's the logistics of it all. Imagine trying to integrate military forces from dozens of countries, each with their own equipment, doctrines, and command structures.
And the financial piece of this is huge, too. Who's going to pay for this? Are we looking at a massive surge in European defense spending?
Absolutely. Creating and maintaining a strong military is incredibly expensive, and right now, most European countries aren't even meeting their NATO spending targets. So if they're serious about a European army, they'll have to make some tough choices about their budgets.
It really makes you wonder what the world would look like if Europe actually managed to create this unified force. How would that reshape the global landscape?
Yeah, that's a question with some really complex answers. It would definitely shift the balance of power, both within Europe and globally. A more militarily powerful Europe could challenge U.S. dominance, maybe even leading to a more multipolar world.
So what would the U.S. think about that? Would they see a more powerful Europe as a good thing or a threat?
That's the million-dollar question. Some people argue that a stronger Europe would actually benefit the U.S. by allowing them to focus on other global priorities. Others are worried that it could lead to more competition or even conflict between the two.
So a lot of potential for some major upheaval. It feels like we're witnessing the birth pangs of a new world order.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to put it. We're definitely at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the coming years will have huge implications for everyone, not just for the future of Europe and the transatlantic alliance, but for global security as a whole.
It's a lot to process for sure. But let's shift gears for a minute and zoom in on the more immediate aftermath of this diplomatic drama. Those speeches at the Munich Security Conference weren't just rhetoric. I mean, they've already had some real-world consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Words have power, especially when they're spoken by world leaders on a global stage. And in this case, those words have really set off a chain reaction that's reshaping the transatlantic landscape.
Okay, so walk us through that. What are we seeing play out in real time?
One immediate consequence has been this flurry of diplomatic activity. European leaders are really scrambling to figure out what to do next. We're seeing these emergency summits, frantic phone calls, a ton of behind-the-scenes negotiations.
So a lot of controlled chaos behind closed doors.
You could say that everyone is trying to do damage control, figure out where they stand, and make sure this doesn't escalate into a full-blown crisis.
How's the public reacting to all of this?
Public opinion is pretty divided, as you might expect. Some people see Zelensky's call for a European army as a necessary step to ensure security in what feels like an increasingly dangerous world.
Makes sense.
Others, though, see it as a reckless move that could undermine NATO and provoke Russia even further.
And what about the reaction to Vance's speech?
That's been even more polarizing. Vance's supporters applaud him for speaking truth to power, for challenging Europe's complacency. His critics, though, accuse him of meddling in European affairs and undermining that transatlantic unity at a time when we need it most.
It sounds like this has really thrown a wrench into the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, you could say that. And the effects of this are still rippling out. It's going to take some time for things to settle down and for us to really understand the long-term consequences of all of this. But one thing is, for sure, the relationship between the U.S. and Europe has entered a new chapter, and it's not clear yet what that chapter holds.
We've talked about the tension, the potential fallout, even some glimmers of hope, but what does this mean for the average person on the street? Should we be stocking up on canned goods and building bunkers?
I don't think we need to go that far. It's important to remember that even with these serious issues, diplomacy is still the main tool for resolving these kinds of disagreements.
So no need to cancel those European vacation plans.
Exactly. Cooler heads usually prevail. But it is a good reminder that these seemingly distant political events can actually have a real impact on our lives. Think about the economic implications of all of this.
Yeah, a strained transatlantic relationship could affect trade, markets, even things like currency exchange rates.
Right. And those kinds of shifts can trickle down and impact things like job security, the cost of living, even the stability of our financial systems.
So this deep dive isn't just about geopolitics, it's about how those global power shifts can actually hit close to home.
Exactly. We're all interconnected in ways we don't always realize.
Before we wrap up, what's the most surprising thing you've learned while researching all of this?
I think what struck me the most is the speed at which things are changing. The assumptions that we've relied on for decades when it comes to the transatlantic relationship, they're being challenged, and the future feels a lot more uncertain than it did just a few months ago.
Yeah, it is kind of unsettling when you think about it.
It can be, but it's also exciting. We're living through a really historic moment of transition, and while there are definitely some risks involved, there's also a lot of potential for positive change.
As we leave our listeners with all of this to ponder, what's one question that should keep them up at night? What's the big thought they should be chewing on?
Here's something to consider. What if a European army actually comes into being, not as a rival to NATO, but as an independent force operating alongside the U.S.? How would that change the global balance of power? Would it lead to more cooperation or more competition? And ultimately, would it make the world a safer or more dangerous place?
Those are some heavy questions. Definitely not the kind you can just Google for a quick answer.
Exactly. And that's what makes this all so fascinating. We've only just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore and analyze and debate. This is just the beginning of the conversation.
And on that note, we'll leave you with those thought-provoking questions. As always, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep those thinking caps on, because the world is changing fast, and the more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to navigate whatever comes next.